Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, January 31st, 2025. It's time to look at human behavior and justifications. Today, we're going to be looking at the issue of homicide in North America. We're specifically going to focus more on Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But nonetheless, we're going to look at the issue a little bit more broadly too. The photo you see there, that little picture, that little munchkin, that cute little 4-year-old with his rifle, yes, that's me. I'm standing sentry and guarding the homestead, of course. That's an actual BB gun, not a real gun, but a BB gun, and it's the one that I grew up with as a youngster. Um, and mostly I used it in a highly responsible fashion, of course. I certainly didn't kill anyone with the BB gun or in any other context, I should quickly add. I did, however, have one unfortunate incident. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, I decided I'd test my marksmanship. So I saw a little bird in a neighbor's yard, and I wasn't trying to kill it or anything, but I thought, gee, I wonder if I could actually hit that little bird from about 30 meters, 40 meters maybe tops, with my BB gun. So I took aim, I fired a shot, and I noticed that bird just dropped right away. So I went running over. What happened? And as it turns out, uh, I had lodged the BB directly in the little bird's head. It was an absolutely perfect kill shot. I felt terrible, you know. And as we did with other pets that had died in our family, I took the bird, I dug a little hole in the backwoods, and I buried it. I gave it a proper burial, right? And then I went inside. I said a few Hail Marys, asked God for forgiveness. We really weren't much of a hunting family, so that's how we manage these types of issues. Anyway, but that's another story, and I'm getting distracted here. So let's talk about the issue at hand, shall we? And that is, why do people kill each other? Of course, there are many reasons, with the most obvious being that as a species, we often are in conflict with one another, and in the extremes, we'll wage warfare at the societal level. The largest scale conflicts are those wars that we're all too well aware of, those wars that have killed literally tens of millions of people just in the 20th century alone. Some estimates put the figure at around 150 million. No one knows exactly because the methodologies for tabulating those that are killed in conflicts and the available evidence vary so dramatically. Moreover, armed conflicts extend, of course, beyond warfare to include things like genocides or insurgencies that are launched against governments, and a range of other additional dispute settlement strategies and mechanisms. And while we may not be able to determine the exact numbers of those who've been deceased, the underlying causes of their grievances with one another and those that lead to large scale conflicts and ultimately to millions of individuals being killed are well studied and reasonably well known. In the North American context, however, we don't typically witness the immediacy of wars in our countries here. Um, we have certainly participated in many wars abroad and other parts of the world, but there's not been any large scale international disputes or wars waged on North American soil for the most part throughout the 20th century, save for some examples like the bombing of Pearl Harbor would count, the Battle of 27 August 1918 between Mexican forces and the U.S. Army during the Mexican Border War. But by and large, we've been spared of the open warfare, the horrific instances that we've seen internationally in other parts of the world on our own soils. There certainly have been conflicts, there have been skirmishes, there have been uprisings, there's been There have been protests of various kinds, as well as internal disputes between governments and terrorist organizations, drug cartels, and other insurgencies. But that said, we've been largely spared the physical and psychological damages that those who have lived in and who continue to live in war zones have experienced. Again, I can't even imagine what it must be like personally. We should be extremely grateful in that regard for our relative peace and prosperity, especially in places like Canada and the United States. Now, that said, there is a common scourge that does afflict many countries, and especially in the North American context as well. So, what we see in particular are that the North American homicide rates are actually remarkably high in global perspective. And indeed, many of the highest rates of homicide in the world, that is, at the country level, are found amongst North American countries. In fact, several of the North American countries are among the top 10 countries with the highest homicide rates in the world. And so, in the aggregate, we can say that the homicide rates across North America are, in fact, the highest in the world, followed closely in the aggregate by African nations. Now, as a reminder, North America actually includes 23 independent countries in total, and various non sovereign states as well. And of the estimated 582 million people who live in these 23 countries, roughly 87% live in the big three. That is, the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So, if we're looking at homicide rates, then we typically measure these in terms of the rates of homicide per 100,000 population. We standardize the figure because obviously population bases vary dramatically from country to country. And we have extremely solid, if not perfect, data on homicides and homicide rates, especially in places like Canada and the United States. And so, what I want to share here is the actual distribution of the estimated homicide rates for all 23 countries in North America in the year 2022. And this is based mainly on the data from the World Population Review. Again, I'll include a link in the description below for that and for a couple of other resources if you're interested. And so here we go. The 2022 North American homicide rates by country. Now, if you're seeing this vlog on your cell phone, I'm imagining that this will be very difficult to see. But even on your computers, it might be a little bit hard to see as well. But what you see there are the homicide rates, again, per 100,000 population across all 23 countries in descending order. So the highest rates then are found in Jamaica at just over 50 50 killed per 100,000 population, followed by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, and St. Lucia, then Honduras, Bahamas, Belize, and then Mexico. And again, you'll see the descent of the homicide rates across the various countries down to the United States, which is third from the bottom, then Cuba, and then Canada, which has the lowest homicide rate in North America. I don't know if these rates surprise you, but I want to talk a little bit more about them. In particular, it's interesting to note that the United States is actually at the very low end of homicide rates in North America. And I think that that might actually surprise some people. But I also want to look a little bit more deeply, as I say, at Canada, the US, and Mexico, the big three, as I've called them, in terms of population bases. And so what we see here are the trends, the homicide trends, from dating back to the late 1970s right up to through 2021. Again, it may be difficult to see on a cell phone, but the homicide rates for Mexico, I should say, are in green. For the United States, they're in blue, and for Canada, in orange. And what we see, of course, is that every year for more than 4+ decades, Mexico has the highest homicide rates, often by a large margin, but especially since 2008. Mexico's homicide rate has been in the upper 20s, close to 30 homicides per 100,000 population for the last several years. The United States, as you can see, is always in the middle, with rates having declined gradually through 2014 over the longer sweep of time. And especially in comparison with the peak years, if you look at look at the United States in greater depth and detail, you'll find that the peak years for homicides, at least within this time span, go back to 1980, late 1970s, and then at the same time recurred or spiked up again in the early 1990s. But then, as I said, they sort of experienced a long, gradual decline, not every single year, but most years. And then since 2014, the homicide rate in the US has started to creep back up a little bit. So that's concerning. And then in Canada, we've seen a fairly steady 4 decade run with a homicide rate hovering just around, in and around 2 per 100,000 population. Canada only exceeded 3 per 100,000 twice, and those are back in, it's not shown on the chart here, but those are back in the mid 1970s. So again, the Canadian homicide rate clearly has been consistently the lowest amongst the big three, and indeed has been the lowest in North America for some time. Now, what explains the differences? So there are a number of broad factors that tend to be correlated with homicide, including, I would always start with gender. First and foremost, more than 90% of homicides globally, not just in North America, are committed by males, and of whom the majority, over 80%, the majority of the victims are also males. Women obviously can and do commit homicides as well, but in far um, lower proportions. And instead, what we see is that when females are targeted or when they're victims, they're certainly much more often killed in the context of their intimate partnership, whereas males are killed by other males in stranger conflicts or acquaintances, or other, and sometimes even in familial context. But women, the dominant trend, some talk about femicide, is the extent to which they're killed within their intimate partner or family relationships. Now, apart from the gender issue, there's a lethal cocktail as well of, I'm sorry, I wanted to talk first about the poverty rates, because poverty and resource deprivation and the levels of income inequality are clearly factors that affect homicide rates across the North American context and in other parts of the world as well. So these are factors that we can look at. And by comparison, by the way, you'll see that the levels of homicide rates, if you're looking at the European context, are generally lower than the global estimates in many other parts of the world. So again, that has to do to some degree with concentrations of poverty, resource issues, and levels of income inequality, which tend to be less in the European context. The lethal cocktail, which I alluded to just a moment ago, typically involves young people who are also poorly educated and living in areas with high unemployment, few opportunities. That's something that seems to drive younger people into violence. And to be clear, homicide rates in general are always much higher where you've got when you've got more young people in general and young adults who are most often responsible for a disproportionate share of the homicides that occur. And again, regardless of the country. And in fact, those countries that have higher uh, senior populations tend to also have lower homicide rates. So that's not an accident or a statistical artifact. That reflects real differences in terms of the lived experiences of people and what are young people doing versus older people and so on. And the availability of firearms matters as well. We see that very clearly, not just in the United States, but in other countries too. And especially if we were to look at the degree to which firearms are regulated, controlled, licensed, and available to peoples, uh, like in Europe or in Canada, again, where we see less access to firearms. And then we have to also mention the importance of drug cartels and organized crime, These are critical factors, especially in concert with the relative strength or lack thereof in terms of law enforcement and levels of government stability. So these are sort of broader global indicators or factors that may put some peoples or some countries, I should say, in the aggregate at greater risk for homicide or having higher homicide rates than others. Mexico, these factors really do contribute then across countries to homicide rates, but Mexico is disproportionately affected. Okay, they suffer from more of these global predictors than certainly than the United States and Canada by comparison. And they also have seen a spike then in the numbers or expansion in the numbers of the drug cartels or DTOs, drug trafficking organizations. So that's had a disparate effect on their homicide rates. Um, and there's even a seasonal effect associated with the drug trade in Mexico, where groups are competing with one another to secure a greater share of the available product. That matters. And you see the homicide rates spike then in Mexico accordingly. They also tend to have, that is in Mexico, a less effective rule of law. The law tends to be a little bit weaker in general. They have much lower conviction rates and clearance rates than in the US and Canada. And at the same time, oops, let me sorry, go back to that. And at the same time, I wanted to mention that the Mexico has launched their own war on drugs and a number of military interventions aimed at trying to get the issues under control. But that's actually led to further retaliation and an escalation of homicide rates. So they're still in the thick of the struggles, especially since you saw from the data since about 2008. And that issue has yet to be resolved. Be interesting to see what happens under their leadership of the new president, the first female elected president in Mexico, to see if they're able to fashion new plans or intervene or change other aspects of their social and economic conditions. But for now, Mexico continues to be in rough shape with respect to homicide rates. The rates are certainly much lower in the US compared to Mexico, but still alarming to many analysts or citizens, depending on your perspective on these issues. The key drivers include the extension of the drug trade and organized crime in the US. Our various social networks and our ties to the Mexican cartels are one example, but we have our own share of organized crime here in the United States as well. Um, and there's certainly a problem in with homicides that are gang related, although they're not the majority by any stretch of the imagination. But youth violence in general is a problem that's linked to many of the risk factors that are associated with higher rates of homicide in general, and especially amongst in the US, African American teens in the proverbial inner city neighborhoods, and that lethal cocktail that I mentioned with respect to poverty, lack of education, and job opportunities, and then the drug trade and territorial disputes and so forth. So you'll see elevated homicide rates in certain cities, certain large urban populations within the United States context. And indeed, there's more urbanization in the U.S., and that has an effect too, with the majority of homicides occurring in the context of larger cities, where you've got more destitute poverty, shall we say. There's higher levels of anonymity, perhaps, and maybe even a lesser degree of civility, although that's a more speculative comment on my part. But the issues, I think, seem to be linked to how people organize their lives and how they manage their affairs in general, and what are the drivers of stress and frustration and anger and conflict across the spectrum of different living situations. Um, and so that's something that we need to look at, or I'll comment a little bit more about that in just a moment. But you have to talk as well about the availability of firearms. Okay, the US has much greater access compared to places such as Canada, and clearly there's some correlation with homicide rates, especially since we tend to kill the people that we know. And my point is that having a gun around when there's a volatile situation or a domestic dispute or a drug problem or a conflict of some kind These are the kinds of issues that having guns available is going to increase the risk of lethal outcomes as a general principle. And indeed, most telling in this regard is that the most commonly cited reason for homicides perpetrated in the US has to do with arguments that people are having, disputes that have ratcheted up perhaps and out of control. And again, that's not to suggest there aren't millions of completely responsible gun owners in the US and in Canada for that matter. There certainly are. It's just that having the guns around increases the likelihood of lethal outcomes if disputes turn particularly heated. Right? So again, it's another risk factor amongst many. Okay, and by the way, I thought it might be compelling if I shared a personal example of what I mean by the notion of the risk factor. Okay, so again, spoiler alert, if you find these types of personal issues disturbing, you may want to walk out of the room for a couple of minutes. But the story that I wanted to mention is one that happened to yours truly. Okay, and so this happened when I was a teenager. And it was in the context, it was shortly after my parents had divorced. And at that point, it was the summer of 1978. I was 16 years old. And I was living with my father. And as we entered into the latter portions of the summer, everybody, I guess I still had two sisters who'd gone off to college, off to university. And so I was just living alone with my father. And my mother and father had split up. My mother was living in her own condo. Anyway, long story short, what happened was I was, well, I was training for football, lifting weights, that sort of thing, and I was doing that in our little screened off porch. And my dad was there with me this one particular day as I was training, and we got into some kind of an argument. I don't know exactly what the details were. I vaguely remember it being something about me being frustrated about my parents' relationship and why they separated. And as I say, my mother had moved out. My dad, I think, was saying some mean things, and I didn't like that. You know, again, I loved them both, but I didn't like the fact that I was there stuck, and my dad was having a few drinks too, and then starting to talk ill of my mother. So at some point, I guess I set the weights down, and I walked over to confront my father, and he stood up, and we were sort of face to face, and I made that decision as a strong 16-year-old football player. I wasn't going to listen to my dad badmouth my mother, and so I shoved him. Yeah, I remember vividly exactly that sequence of events. And that caused him to, again, he'd had a few drinks too, and it caused him to stumble and fall, right? So again, I felt bad about that, but at the same time, I felt, that I had to defend my mother, and I was angry, and he was angry, and so on. So that's how the dispute ratcheted up. Well, what's the relevance to today's discussion? Well, at that point too, my dad was really pissed, and so he went and he ran to grab his gun because he had a firearm. He was an FBI agent, so he had a legally owned firearm, and he basically said, and I vividly remember him saying, I'm going to kill you. And so he ran and grabbed his gun. And I, of course, didn't stick around to wait for the outcome. So I ran out of the house. And again, I remember quite distinctively running up. We have this hill outside of our house. And I remember running up the hill and just getting out of there. My dad came stumbling out of the house, and uh, just, in fairness, he did not actually fire a shot at me. There were no shots fired in the dark or that sort of thing. But I was scared, and he did threaten to kill me with his gun, and I knew it was better to not stick around and wait to see what might have happened, right? So the point, of course, being that, yeah, sometimes disputes get out of control, even in my life, in that particular context, as an example. And thankfully, I was able to get out of there, and thankfully, nobody was hurt, right? And I wasn't hurt. Um, so that's a really, I think, powerful, perhaps a disturbing example, but it also highlights a couple of key kind of sociological axioms, if you will, right? So, on the one hand, as I mentioned, we're sort of at the greatest risk for experiencing violence and serious violence on average within our own families, within amongst our intimates, Okay, that's where we're at the greatest risk of experiencing personal violence, literally from people that we know and often family members. And second, by the same token, we also tend to be most forgiving of our family and members, of our intimates. That is, we're much less likely to get the police involved if we do experience violence at the hands of someone we know. And I'll throw the question out there. Uh, do you think that that incident that my father got reported to the police for threatening to kill and getting his gun, threatening to kill his own son? No, of course not. The police never heard about that. Now you've heard about it. But yeah, that's an example. And again, most conflicts and most violence within families is swept under the rug or dealt with internally and so forth. Okay. So again, these are issues that I will address further in future blogs. But at the same time, a little bit of shameless self-promotion, I've addressed in my book many of these issues around family conflict and violence. And indeed, I have published my book with Cambridge scholars, an integrated investigation, right, of family violence. So yeah, if you're interested in my book, I'll include a link to that as well. It's a little bit pricey, but it's a really nice, pretty book. It's a hardcover. I've got a soft cover version as well that's available. But anyway, in this book, I do an in-depth, a deep dive into the theory and the research on intimate partner violence, four major types of domestic violence: intimate partner violence, child abuse, elder mistreatment, and then the least studied of the issues, sibling rivalry and aggression and violence. So I devote a chapter to each of these in terms of, again, both how do we explain them and different kinds of violence too, which I won't go into further today. So if you're interested, that's something we can look into further. All right. And then finally, I just want to mention about the Canadian context. Okay, because in Canada, where we have the consistently the lowest homicide rates, the aggregate risk factors at the societal and the community levels are indeed less by a number of different measures in comparison with the US and certainly in comparison with Mexico. Okay, all of which, of course, helps reduce the aggregate or global risk for homicide in Canada. We certainly have income inequality here, and we have some large urban centers as well. But the socioeconomic factors and indicators and the levels of income inequalities and even the overall levels of urbanization are not as intense and not as skewed as in, for example, the United States. We also have homelessness here, right? Again, I don't want to misstate the facts. We have homelessness. We have people suffering with drug addictions, all the usual issues that large scale contemporary advanced industrial societies face. But the one thing that we have working in our favor that helps mitigate some of the worst effects would be our universal healthcare system. So that goes a long way in terms of dealing with some of the problems that do persist. Um, and then we also obviously have gangs in Canada. We have, and they're a real problem in certain areas. We even have gangs in London, Ontario, this otherwise reasonably tame, sleepy little town a couple of hours outside of Toronto. So much so that we actually got an investment from the federal government the year before last to help deal with the gang problem. But having said that, I don't really see it much in my day-to-day experiences and walking around the streets here and going to the different places that we frequent and so forth. So it's just not nearly to the same degree, I would say, as it is in the United States and other places. Okay. And then, we do have guns here in Canada. And Canadians love guns too. I mean, many do. The difference is that it tends to be much more highly regulated. Okay, so again, we own guns in Canada. Many people own lots of guns and so on, but we have to register our firearms here. We have to take training courses in gun safety and shooting and so forth to own our guns legally in Canada. Okay, so you have to jump through the hoops and you have to get a license just like you have to get a license for your car and pass the test and so forth. And call us crazy. We just think that that's kind of a reasonable thing to do. And we're cool with it, you know? So that's what we do here. And we're more likely to use our guns for hunting purposes and for sports. Again, we enjoy our guns. In fact, the only place I've ever really shot guns has been here in Canada, interestingly enough, not down in the States. Uh, and I've shot them out of my brother-in-law's hobby farm and so forth. Again, not at any animals or anything living, not certainly not at any people. And I was sure not to shoot the guns at even birds because you know me, sure shot Michalski. So yeah, and I'm very careful with when I'm shooting firearms, shall we say. Being such a good shot and all. Actually, I'm sure that's not the case any longer. My vision has definitely declined dramatically. But anyway, again, that's I'm off on a tangent, typical of me. Anyway, but what about the weather? Just the weather factor. I think that matters, believe it or not. I think that does affect homicide rates. You'll notice that the homicide rates are significantly higher in the warmer climates, right? Where people tend to spend a lot more time, not just out in the hot sun, but, you know, engaging with one another, for better, for worse. And unfortunately, as you know, when we engage people, sometimes we get a little bit heated in our disputes. And the hot weather sort of facilitates that, shall we say. Okay. And then you get to the US, and the weather patterns are a little bit more diverse. And you've got the northern climes. And again, you have, the seasons, and all of that has some effect as well on homicide rates. We actually see the seasonal effect that we can measure. And then by the time we get to Canada, where we've got the longest winters on average and the shorter summers, well, again, I'm not suggesting that the weather is the determining factor, but I can tell you we spend a lot more time up here shoveling snow. If I were to point my camera outside, you'll see what I'm talking about. And then that goes on for several months. And then we're also trying to figure out how to get to our jobs and how to get to school or just how to get to the store. All of these issues, I think, matter, right, in terms of our daily patterns of living. And so, we have to kind of help each other out too to manage with the weather and our conditions. And so basically, we have a lot less time and opportunity to kind of get all fired up about disputes with one another anyway. And then, of course, in Canada, if things do get a little bit too heated, we have that great Canadian option, right? Hey, let's just go have a beer, right? Let's go to the cottage. Let's relax, chill, literally with a beer. Anyway, okay. A little bit more seriously, then we'll wrap up here. But there's a lot more that can be said and discussed with respect to crime patterns and homicide rates in particular. But I thought I'd share some of the data and some of the thinking and the broader kinds of global risk factors that appear to be related to homicide patterns, both within and beyond the North American context. And this is kind of what I do with my university teaching. When I teach my students, I like to share information and knowledge with them. And mostly I want to stimulate their thinking deeply and more rigorously about these issues. I don't have all the answers. I'm not right in everything that I say or in all my theories, etc. But I'm constantly trying to refine my understanding. And that's what I encourage my students to do. Okay. And then sometimes, just to make it even more interesting or to make the issue stick, I'll try to tie the issues back into perhaps some personal experiences or ask people to reflect upon their own personal experiences to see how the information resonates. Okay, that's enough for today, as ever. In the meantime, may you continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And we'll see you soon.